right, welcome. I want to welcome to UNC Asheville students, faculty, staff, alumni, and the greater Asheville community, both online and in person. My name is Robert Tatum. I'm the Carrie Caperton Owen Professor in Economics here at UNC Asheville. I want to thank my fellow co-sponsors, Mark Gibney, the Carol Belk Distinguished Professor in Humanities, also the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for their amazing help in making this event possible. We also have some great folks here working this event, and I appreciate them being here. I'd like to begin actually with an announcement. Come back here, maybe not this very room, I'll get you the details on that, but sometime in February, we're also going to have a talk by a Harvard-educated economist who's also a Notre Dame educated theologian, Dr. Mary Hirschfeld. She's the author of the book, Aquinas and the Market Toward a Human Economy, so continuing on some themes of theology as it relates to economics. One of the many fine things for which UNC Asheville is known is its humanities program. In our humanities sequence, we expose students to text from the ancient to the modern, not only for their intrinsic value, but also for their application in our contemporary lives. Likewise, UNC Asheville is known for its interdisciplinarity, specifically how different disciplines can inform each other's works. Following these two fine UNC Asheville traditions, I began working at the intersection of economics and theology about 6 years ago. One theologian whose writings have been particularly useful to my work is Dr. Miroslav Volf. And let me just talk about how I connect to his work for just a minute as I begin to introduce him. My current work, the paper I'm working on right now, is on the economics and theology of globalization. You would think I would draw inspiration from his very fabulous book, Flourishing, Why We Need Religion in a Globalized World. But it was actually his award-winning Exclusion and Embrace, a theological exploration of identity, otherness, and reconciliation that inspired and informed my work on globalization the most. This is a book he actually wrote as he contemplated ethnic conflict in the former Yugoslavia, in the area he grew up in, the conflict that you all will remember from the 1990s. But it wasn't actually about economic globalization, though that's what I drew from it. Why am I telling you this? Why is this part of my introduction? Because whether you're an economist, a philosopher, a business person, an artist, a scientist, or whatever you are, I know you're going to get something out of Dr. Volf's talk and his wider sets of works. And so I just told you about two of them, but there are certainly other ones out there that are worth taking a look at. His A Public Faith, For the Life of the World are also worth looking at. But I want you to hear from him yourself. So let me briefly introduce our guest speaker so that you all can have more time with him. The sense is we're going to try to do about an hour for him to present, and followed up by some 30 minutes maybe for Q&A. While I'm thinking about it, I'll go ahead and mention the Q&A mic is right over there. We'll try to remind you of that, but so people can hear at home, that are listening at home, and for recording purposes, we ask that you actually use that mic. But I'm going to keep my introduction very brief. There's so many things I could say about him, but you can go look about him, and I encourage you to do so. He is the Henry B. Wright Professor of Theology at Yale Divinity School and is the founder and director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. He's written more than 20 books, including these fine ones I was just telling you about, and over 100 scholarly articles. So, without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Volf. He's speaking on striving for superiority.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have actually a live audience. I know it's wonderful also to have not live audience. I mean, that's not the right way to put it, right? But you know what I mean. At any rate, those of you who are here, thank you for coming. And I'm delighted to be here. I wish I could have come a little bit earlier and stayed a little bit longer to be in this absolutely magnificent environment in which you live and you work, which is great. So my topic for tonight is striving for superiority, and I've named it an introduction, or I think maybe an adventure in thinking and exploration, or something of that sort. Because when I started thinking about it, I tried to find literature on it, and I had to go pretty far back to Rousseau and some folks of this sort in order to find inspiration for thinking about this issue and to affirm the relevance of it. So I'll try to then argue or tell you why I think that the issue matters a great deal, and possibly how we might want to think possibilities, how we might want to think about it. And actually, you'll see where I tend, but I will actually not commit myself to a position. I'm interested in our conversation together. This is organized by Economics Department, and striving for superiority is a contentious theme also in business community, with none less than Warren Buffett on the side of those contesting the value of striving for superiority and arguing instead for the striving for excellence or for competing with oneself. Now, I will not even try to enter economic sphere here. I will not explore the monetary significance of striving for superiority. I will not even explore the performance side of striving for superiority. And for most of us, sports come immediately in mind when we think about striving for superiority. My question is this, and I'm so glad that this is a humanities place, because my question is this: what is the human value or disvalue of striving for superiority? Now, at the same time, I want to return a little bit to the domain of economy. As the word itself indicates economy, it comes from Greek word oikos, which means house. Economy has to do something with home and its technology of managing its resources. So, as part of the larger goal to live in a healthy home, that's where I, for myself, situate economic activity. That's the context in which also I want to think about superiority and how superiority question nonetheless intersects with the economic question, even though I will deal simply with the relations of human beings to themselves, us to ourselves, and to others. So my question is, the place of striving for superiority in the relation of each person to themselves and to others. Even if I throw him, he will deny having fallen and gets away with it, convincing the people who saw him fall. Now, you might think of presidential elections for 2 years ago as I read this, but actually the quote comes from about 2,400 years ago. A general by the name of Pericles, he's here in view, and one of his contestants in wrestling was asked who is a better wrestler, either the person who was being addressed or Pericles. And this is the answer you got. Even when I throw him down, he refuses to recognize that he has fallen and persuades others that to believe in his falsehood. Now, commenting on this story and the uncompromising striving for superiority it illustrates, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was interested in the question of superiority, writes, "The greater and more eminent a Greek man is, the brighter the flame of ambition to erupt from him, consuming everyone who runs with him on the same track." But striving for superiority is not just a sport of the great and eminent or of those who just imagine themselves to be such. In fact, that striving for superiority is everywhere. I'm moving from one terminal to another in Chicago O'Hare Airport. All of you have flown there, and then you have to go down the escalator, and then you take a moving walkway, and then you get up the escalator, except that I don't take escalators. I take my bags, and I walk down, and I walk up, and I walk on the side, and I really feel cool about myself. I'm so much better. Better ecologically conscious, better for my health. I'm this superior specimen among the sea of folks who are wasting our resources and not trying to strengthen their muscles, striving for superiority. We compare our virtue and our wealth, our attire and looks, our successes as scholars, or our prowess as influencers, our health, our color of our skin, our fitness, and the lands of our origin. And in all this, we often place ourselves on a single scale of superiority and inferiority, hoping to find ourselves above our competitors. Not necessarily above all of them, but at least above some relevant comparisons. And if we think that we might be below them, striving to catch up with them and to overtake them. Some philosophers have argued even to converse with one another is to be engaged in some kind of subtle struggle for superiority. Søren Kierkegaard, who's written quite a bit on superiority, I wish I had time to go into his own thought on this question, but he was also talking about this, how prevalent that is, and then he gave the following interpretation of one of the passages from Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus points to lilies and the birds, and he said, let those lilies and birds be our teacher, because any teacher might be seeking to exercise superiority over his pupils. And so in order to avoid getting into this superiority contestation, Jesus chose for the teachers lilies and the birds. Now, striving for superiority. Now, to make clear what I mean by striving for superiority, and before I delve into my lecture, let me make some quick distinctions. And I will make three distinctions. One is distinction between comparison and competition. I said earlier that competition or comparisons and competitions, striving for superiority is everywhere. It's probably an exaggeration, but it's prevalent. Certainly comparisons are everywhere. And Oxford Dictionary says that to compare is to consider or estimate similarities or dissimilarities between two things or people. We do it absolutely all the time, and we cannot imagine life being possible without these kinds of comparisons. But comparisons is not yet competition. Competition, I think, arises when the desire emerges in me to have a thing that my neighbor or whoever has that is equally as good as his or hers, or maybe a little bit better, or when I chafe under the idea that I possess something that is worse, or when I even need to justify how it is that I have this because it was expected I would be at least equal or higher than him. But I'm better in this, therefore I don't need to worry about that I'm driving Honda Fit and he's driving Audi e-tron GT, right? Or something of that sort. So that's the distinction between competition and comparison. Now, I want to make also distinction between striving for excellence and striving for superiority. Now, that distinction is also, I think, fundamental. And as I've said in earlier discussions that we had privately, if I weren't able to make that distinction, I think the whole of my investigation would kind of collapse. We would be simply in striving for excellence. Then, if we are striving for superiority, then, well, that's what it is. We might try to understand it better, but there's nothing to really decide. Striving for excellence is to be better in some regard. It's simply to improve. Striving for superiority is to be better than others, and that striving for superiority is essentially competitive. Striving for excellence is not competitive. Striving for excellence, if I compete, then I compete with myself, but I don't need to compete with anyone else in order to strive for excellence. For superiority, on the other hand, that's competition with others. Striving for superiority over them is essential. Now, there are various cases in life where striving for excellence seems to be very closely tied to striving for superiority. In sports, that may be the case, right? Where the very value of what is excellent is established in competitive kinds of context. I'll leave that aside, and maybe we can take this up for discussion. Now, the third distinction that I want to make is this, and that is distinction between being better at something than somebody else, or being better than somebody else as person. Being better at and being better as person. Generally, when we think about superiority, we think primarily about A, strives to be superior to B at some activity or some thing, C, right? So it's in a limited domain, I strive to be superior over somebody. Or if my ambition is really great, I strive to be superior than everybody else. Then I strive to be the GOAT, the greatest of all times. Now, often though, striving to be better at something or being better at something is taken at the same time to indicate that I am also, just because of that, better as a person. So that kind of performative superiority translates into superiority as a human being. And now we are at a very important anthropological question, anthropological juncture, how it is that we become who we are, how it is that we acquire as human beings worth. If it is through my performance, then being better at C or being better at number of Cs might in fact redound to me being better specimen of humanity, actually. But if it is that my humanity is not defined by performance, then it could be that no matter how good I am at C, or quite a few Cs, much better than, for instance, you who are sitting here, my audience, or let's invert this and think of it the other way. As human being, I have equal worth to everyone else. Now, I think, as anybody else, I think that's one of the really fundamental issues that we are facing, not just in this domain, but in many domains in modern life. Okay, so this is a few introductory remarks and then 3 distinctions. So my central goal in this lecture is to explore the extents to which it might be important to reject striving for superiority while affirming striving for excellence. And second, to resist any sense that we are better human beings than others on account of being more excellent in any particular way than they. Right? So this fundamental sense of our humanity as tied to our performance is what this lecture is really about. Now, though we swim in waters colored by the striving for superiority, which is what I tried to indicate at the very beginning, we are often like the two young fish in the now famous parable David Foster Wallace told at the beginning of his 2005 commencement address on compassionate life. You're familiar with that, as an older fish passes by two younger fish swimming the other way. It nods to them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" The young fish do not see and therefore aren't concerned about what envelops them from all sides. Why should we be aware of and possibly concerned about the striving for superiority which colors the cultural waters in which we swim? That's a different way to name my question. Now, it's important to keep in mind that there is an ancient and now half-forgotten disagreement about whether striving for superiority is life-giving ingredient of our social environment or a dangerous pollutant, or perhaps a bit of both. And so in the first part of the main body of my lecture, I want to give you a taste for the origins or early stage of that debate between these two positions. So one of them comes from Greece. And at the beginning of his poem, didactic poem, Works and Days, the Greek poet Hesiod, and he lived 700 BC, he sings praises to goddess of strife, Eris. But he says there were two goddesses, in fact, of strife. There's an older one, and that older goddess of strife is a bad Eris. Eris is strife, right? Goddess of the kind of striving for superiority that promotes wicked war and feuding. That's a quote from him. She is a cruel thing that deserves to be condemned. And then he contrasts a younger goddess, Eris, and calls her good Eris, who then says that she has a very different disposition. And after noting that it was Zeus, the king of the gods, who placed the good Eris on the roots of the earth and among humans, Hesiod describes the goddess. She drives even the unskilled man to work. And if someone who lacks property sees someone who is rich, he likewise hurries to sow and to plant, to set his house in order. Neighbor competes with neighbor for prosperity. This Eris is good for men. Even potters harbor grudges against potters, carpenters against carpenters, beggars envy beggars. Striving for superiority and the envy that drives don't just contribute to development and even individuals. That was the point that Hesiod is making. Progress in crafts, in arts and sciences, all rest on striving for superiority and jealousy. Zeus has wisely placed Eris at the very roots of the earth. Now, that's on the Greek side, as one representing one strand of thinking. The other strand comes from biblical traditions, and probably the best place to start is the ancient Hebrew book called Ecclesiastes, or in Hebrew, Kohelet. It is traditionally attributed to King Solomon. which would then place the text somewhere in 970 to 931 BC. Most likely it was written somewhere around 450. That's also ancient, not quite 700 BC, but nonetheless. You're familiar with that rather pessimistic book. And the King Solomon, Solomon wrote it, attributed to him, agrees with Hesiod that all toil and skill in work comes from one person, envy of another. But in Kohelet's world, the race, he quotes, is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor the bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to skillful, but time and chance happen to them all. Now, his point is not that often our skill and superiority, actually how we perform, doesn't win victories, but that even when we win, even when we exert ourselves and achieve our purpose, we ultimately end up empty-handed. Skill and toil in work born of the striving for superiority are vanity and chasing after wind, no matter how impressive their results may turn out to be. Now, Kohelet is not very popular in the modern world. From the beginning of modernity, the kind of sense of affirmation of the goodness of ordinary life seems to be undermined by him. There is in the Bible tradition that pushes against the striving for superiority, but does not have this kind of negative view of the effects of human labor as Kohelet does. And you find it represented, for instance, in Apostle Paul. The famous text is in the Epistle of Ephesians, where he writes, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or empty conceit, but in humility regard others as superior to yourselves." Now, some translations say, consider them better than yourselves. And the commentators are then a little bit, shall we say, in a pickle. How do you consider somebody to be better than you when you know that they're not better than you in many regards, right? Do you have to kind of lie in being humble? And Calvin then suggests, well, no, what you do is you find the area in which that person is superior, and then you affirm that area. But I think then you can think in all other areas, I'm superior. You know how to tie your shoelaces so amazingly. But my tennis playing, if it's that, I think somehow Paul has missed the point. I won't go into exegetical justification of what I'm going to propose, though I think there is such. I think what the translation that I used was consider others superior to yourself, meaning treat them in such a way that you give them honor as you would give to somebody of superior standing, right? And that kind of fits also with what Apostle Paul says in another text, which we generally don't mention when we talk about ethical injunction of Apostle Paul. It's a very simple line that I think is actually revolutionary. Here's how it goes. It's a half of a short verse. And it goes like this: outdo one another in showing honor. Now that puts the striving for superiority on its head, right? In fact, it doesn't just put it on its head, it cancels it altogether. For those who strive for superiority are seeking to do their components in acquiring honor. Striving for superiority is striving for distinction. Paul urges Romans instead to be superior in showing honor, which is to say, to give up the striving for superiority, striving to be greater than others. You have then this confirmed also in the teaching of Jesus. You remember, some of you might remember the famous story when disciples came to Capernaum, and when Jesus came into the house, Jesus asked him, "What were you arguing about on the way?" It's almost like, I have a 4-year-old daughter, right? And I can almost imagine myself asking some such question, "What were you doing there?" or something of that sort. And suddenly their spines are straight, eyes are looking straight at him, and they are, just like my little daughter, silent. For on the way, they had argued which one was the greatest among them. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be the last of all and servant of all." Again, he's not saying, strive to be the last, and then you can argue who's greatest among you, right? The one who wins in being the last will be the greatest. He's subverting the whole idea of striving for superiority. So we have these two major traditions, and I think we have them also running straight through the history, and we have them also present today. A lot of discussion is about how competition is fundamental, not just fundamental in a sense that we can do without it, but that we would be much worse off without having striving for superiority and competition in that sense. I think we live today in a peculiar kind of a moment. That is little bit, our societies are organized in a different way than ancient societies, and that heightens the importance of striving for superiority for us. It doesn't make it a simply modern phenomenon, but it heightens its importance. Now, clearly, competition and comparative advantage are central to contemporary societies. Sports, in economy, politics. One with the most toys wins. In science too, in arts, often folks like me, we forget how competitive life is and how brutal life is, how vain professors, for instance, academics like I am. And it's important to keep, obviously, in mind. Competition is fierce. Even if in the process, which may be typical or not, everyone improves. The gain of the one is the loss of another. And the distinctions are accentuated. In the ancient times, though, competition was more of a human drive for survival. Today, competition is a kind of, and striving for superiority is a rational strategy in an escalation-oriented, competitively organized social formation. That's a quote from sociologists. That is sociology speak. But sociology speak simply means that we organize the entirety of our societies. They're kind of escalation-oriented. You always have to escalation. Basically, I'm drawing on German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, who's written early work on escalation as an acceleration as a feature of key feature of modern societies, and basically say modern society, you have to live in modern societies the way you ride the bicycle. You have to pedal. If you stop pedaling, you fall. And in fact, even more than just you have to pedal in your own pace, you have to pedal faster and faster, because if you don't, you will then fall. In such societies, that's organized around competitively, striving for superiority is fundamental. Now, consider, though, effects, and I would say disastrous effects of striving for superiority in 3 domains. First is our self-worth. Second is our relationship to things. And third is our relationship to other people or persons. So first, often disastrous effects of striving for superiority on self-worth. And especially that's important given the tendency to think that being better at C makes me better as human being. And if I'm not as good at C, I'm somehow inferior. Its costs can be high, especially in modern societies, in which for the most part, what is good, and therefore what is better or worse, is not defined by an objective standard, but is the shifting result of the competition itself. Good, then, is not an independent thing, but the good, then, is simply to be better than someone else or than everyone else. And as a consequence of that, any achievement is unstable, threatened not just to be outdone, but also devalued by competition. Achievement is a source of fleeting contentment and constant worry. And because great majority of people, among the great majority of people, there are always those who are significantly better than I am. Striving for superiority systematically generates inferiority. I always give example of, and it's the first time actually when this question struck me in its significance, is teaching Yale undergrads, who all have come to Yale because they were pretty close to the top of their high school. They come to Yale and everybody has been on the top of their high school. And suddenly they compare themselves, and they've been comparing themselves, drawing self-worth from this incredible achievement that they have had. They've been shepherded into that. They come to the classroom, and everybody is as good as them, and everybody seems like they're better than them. They start comparing themselves, and some people suggest that some of the reasons for skyrocketing depression in society in generally, but also in institutions of higher learning, is precisely that kind of striving for superiority in an environment where there are no objective criteria. There is no objective. You always compare yourself. You know how good you are relative to the standing of other people, and you are constantly being undermined in your sense of self-worth. Just as a footnote, for a while I've been now influenced by a French sociologist, Alain Ehrenberg. I'm pronouncing this in a German way, not in French way, so sorry, but whoever is French here, I ask for apologies, but it is a German name. He has written a very interesting book, which is a kind of cultural history of depression. And cultural history of depression basically means, why is it that in the mid-century, or first part of the 20th century, depression was not a prevalent condition, let's call it that way. People might have had melancholia, people were mourning, but kind of depression was not nearly as widespread phenomenon. And then the 70s and on, it skyrockets and now is the signature psychological malady. And his argument is that's because we live in achievement-oriented societies that are competitive without any clear standard, with all the standards of value eroded. And all standards of values are generated in the competition itself. And the result is a certain sense of, a reinforced sense of inferiority for the majority of people. I am never good enough. Whatever I do is never good enough. So, self-worth and striving for superiority. Now, the striving for superiority also has potentially disastrous effects on our relation to things outside of us, the ordinary object. In the context of striving for superiority, they lose value for what they are in themselves and become instead signifiers of the place on the inferiority-superiority scale of those who possess them. I'm interested in having something because that gives me a certain sense of value relative to somebody else. If somebody were to possess that same thing, suddenly my possession of it has been devalued. And I need something that would boost my advantage in distinction over against others, and that means that ordinary objects or complex objects of art are seen as means that they're functional to my sense of who I am, my sense of superiority. They lose or are devalued as valuable in themselves. Now, that means that a great deal of value is actually completely fictive. That value, because we invest value in something, that's why it ends up being valuable, and we invest value in something because it makes us look better than others. Therefore, rarity is a particularly significant value because you can have the same object that's rare, slightly improved, but rare and expensive, and it'll give you greater value than roughly equivalent object. I watch gold, and I watch just ordinary, right? Value of that watch, qua watch, is the same. But positional value of that watch, of these two watches, is quite a different matter. Now, to me, that's a very, very interesting phenomenon. And it's interesting phenomenon because what we think is material possessions is actually not material possessions at all. They're material things, but they're valuable not qua material things. Problem with modern societies is that we are not materialistic enough. Not that we are materialistic. If we were materialistic enough, we would value the thing as it is. We wouldn't strive to have better thing as soon as somebody has something of the same kind as we do. So you can see where it goes. My final point is that we do the same thing that we do with objects. In striving for superiority, we also do with persons. And you can see that in those who produce those students at Yale who feel inferior because they can't compete sufficiently. Parents who have invested in their education from the time that before kindergarten, you're already too late. If you haven't prepared them well at kindergarten, right? The striving for superiority starts when they're tiny little things, right? And of course, we gain. Parents do that because they're striving for superiority by having those little kids, right? And so how is it going to look at me? I'm a professor of Yale, and if my daughter doesn't, right? So devalued, she is devalued if I treat her that way, on account of some my desire to be superior, or at least somehow up to my expectations of my distinction in comparison with somebody else. We suffer under striving for superiority, and our social and material world suffers under it as well. But striving for superiority has become so much part of our contemporary culture that we can hardly imagine life without it. So we endeavor to regulate it. We regulate it with rules of fair play. We try to curb it, and the way we try to curb it is mainly by highlighting the importance of equality. But since human capacities differ greatly, even when the rules are fair, striving for superiority continually reproduces and deepens inequalities. As we have seen, I hope, much is at stake in the debate, or in what should be a debate but isn't yet, about whether striving for superiority is a great good, as it was for some ancient Greeks and for many moderns, or whether it is an empty goal and a source of human corruption, as it was for many early Christians and those ancient Hebrews who not only passed on to us Kohelet, wisdom of Kohelet, but who recorded for us the story of the builders of the Tower of Babel. Striving for superiority touches everything we humans do, from the quality of everyday interactions on the street, at work, or in the classroom, through highly consequential cultural tensions around race, gender, cultural identity, and class, to the dynamics of national and global economy and politics, from the weather on the landscape of each of our hearts to the future of our planet and the survival of humanity itself. And in all of that, the debate about striving for superiority is about what it means to be human and what is truly human glory. Thank you very much.
So we're going to open the floor to questions and answers. There is the mic, so queue up for that. And if you're online as well, you can ask questions and we'll filter them to Nora.
Hello, Dr. Wolf. I just want to first start by saying thank you so much. This was really thought-provoking, and I've always wanted to hear you speak, and it's wonderful to finally get to do that in person. This is a very selfish question out of sheer interest. I would love to hear you kind of elaborate on how you see this struggle, this striving for superiority manifesting in our current religious moment. In religious culture in America. I would love to hear you elaborate in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. And now as you ask it, I see that it's conspicuously absent from my lecture. But in fact, striving for superiority, religious superiority, has been through the century one of the most significant forms in which superiority has been sought and expressed. And the most incisive, most clear, one of the most clear places of the critique of superiority is a famous story in the Luke's Gospel of the Pharisee and the what's the English word for it? Publican? No. What's Pharisee and the sinful little man? What? Huh? Was it tax collector? Yeah. No, it wasn't Zacchaeus. That's a different story. I think it was a tax collector. Sorry, I know a Croatian word for it, and I'm now missing the English one. And basically, where the Pharisees starts his prayer and says, "Thank you, God, that I am not like," and then gestures to this sinful man, and then follows the list of religious practices which make him excel over this poor specimen of humanity who can do the only thing that he can do is simply beat himself in the chest and recognize himself as a sinner. And then Jesus responds, well, guess who of these two has gone back home justified, affirmed by God? And it is clearly that very tax collector to whom that has happened. So that is, in a sense, clearest example enacted the question of superiority and judgment passed on this by Jesus. That's also present in much of the tradition. There's a famous text by Luther, commentary on Magnificat, which is this poem that Mary sings according to the Gospel of Luke, right? And so there's a kind of line of folks that to whom God will, the rich and the powerful who are taken down from their thrones. Religious folks are not mentioned, but Luther in his commentary says religious folks often think, oh, we're really cool. It's those worldly politicians and the rich people who are really bad. And he goes on to say the religious pride is the worst than any possible other pride. A number of other folks are suggesting the same thing because it's kind of comprehensive. It's not I'm just wealthy and I might be not so great in other domains, but in the most important domain of life, if you're a religious person, I am superior to you or to somebody else. So he suggests that that's the worst kind of pride of all. And I think it can have, depending how strong religious sentiments are, it can have disastrous consequences. Competition then in religious domains becomes kind of a driving force. So I think we have to be keenly aware of that. And I think Kierkegaard kind of indicated this in the same direction, but by saying even the speaker who speaks about it, even the religious, maybe especially religious person who speaks about striving for superiority, better be really careful because it may indicate a sense of superiority on the part of that person.
Thank you for the talk, Professor Wolff. It's a great honor to hear you. I used to read all of your works when I was a graduate student doing philosophy of religion. I wanted to ask if you think that there's a way forward to answering some questions by looking at the virtue ethics tradition's analysis of the deadly sins. It seems like the striving for superiority may be a common feature of vainglory and pride and envy and wrath, but not apathy.
Yeah.
Connected to the depression thing.
Yeah.
If you could speak, if you think there are ways that the virtue ethics analysis might help to think through superiority.
In many ways, I think certainly it can. Humility, on the other hand, is also a virtue, and often it's contrasted with some of the deadly sins and vices, and that contrast I think is really illuminating. And I think most of what I've said here fits a certain account of humility. Humility is also a rather slippery virtue. And it's not just slippery in the sense that every time we somehow think that we are there, we undermine the there-ness of being there in terms of humility. But also it's difficult sometimes to define what humility is. And I've come to think of humility as not thinking lesser of oneself than one thinks of others, but not thinking so much of oneself at all, right? So as not to think of oneself doing what ought to be done without thinking and taking into consideration a particular status that you have that would make it undignified for you to exercise this kind of activity. So in a sense is a certain self-forgetfulness that is a sign of humility. And in some ways that's also for me a sign of proper striving for excellence. It's a certain striving for excellence that's not invested in the standing, but that's invested in the goodness of that what I am striving to actually do. I'm not myself a virtue ethicist, but certainly can appreciate how that would be significant. Most of, as I said, is learned from reflections on humility. Yes.
My name's Robert, and a quick personal comment. When I was a student in this room 52 years ago as a freshman, it was not nearly as hard to get up out of the seat and move around as it was just now. Amazing what 52 years will do. I looked at your bio this afternoon, Dr. Volf, and I noticed that among your books is a book on oppression. I'm a member of an Episcopal church, which is now in the midst of studying a whole concentrated study on what's called sacred ground, about the experiences of those of us in Western Europe and especially in America who have benefited in competition at the expense of other people whose skin was darker. And what that white skin is about and what it brought to me that I never realized as somebody from a working class background. Would you say just a little bit about how white skin has been an unequalizer of competition, especially in America, and of your experience in Western Europe?
Yeah, no, I thank you for raising. I didn't specifically address the issue of race, but obviously in the current moment, but not because of the current moment, because of the whole long history, the question of race is a very, very significant one, and a superiority plays. Well, it's in the name of the vice, right? White superiority and kind of supremacy. Those are the terms that we use, and I think argument that I have, or the direction in which I've suggested that we go, has very much to do with just that history. I think what's so insidious among many things, but certainly what's also insidious about racial superiority is actually that is totally based on some kind of imagined fiction, right? I mean, it's one thing for somebody to feel superior if they're playing basketball as Mike Jordan has played, right? Or some current, even better equivalent to his play. But it's a very different thing that you think you're superior just because your skin has a different pigment. I mean, that's a kind of insanity. That the requirement of distinction and a need for false distinction creates, so as to be able to benefit economically and in other ways, reputationally, in terms of honor, but to a significant degree, so that exploitation and oppression can occur. And we do the nasty things of comparisons not simply for the sake of feeling a distinction, though that's also, I think, a kind of a distinct drive that we have, but also we employ this to other ends, and those other ends are often ends of exploitation, ends of oppression, benefit to ourselves, not in terms of just glory, but in terms of power, in terms of riches, and so on.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Wolf. As I was listening to your talk, I kind of seemed like you were setting up this sort of rat race of seeking superiority within the context of relative or human comparison. And it was easy for me to sort of imagine that the way we kind of escape from the rat race is made by reference to some of the Judeo-Christian sources, theistic valuation and a kind of Western conceptualization of that. And so I was curious, is that the way you think we get out of the rat race, or are there other options to get out of that rat race?
So I've certainly drawn in this lecture primarily on Paul and Jesus in terms of that, but it seems to me that there are, in other religious traditions as well, significant impulses. I'm not as familiar as with other traditions as I am with Christianity, but that we don't have to simply limit ourselves to Christian resources in order to think in those terms. There is something profoundly, I think there's something profoundly human about humility that has been affirmed, that has been nurtured by other traditions as well. I think, for instance, that modern individualism, there are strands also in the Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition, and in general in monotheism, that kind of subvert the attempts to push against the striving superiority, or that seem to legitimize, for instance, something like individualism, right? Once you have the kind of individualism going, and once you are not involved in the kind of, once you don't see your own self in the context of social relations, I think that struggle, that striving for superiority gets to be in some ways heightened. Once you lose also a sense of inhabiting a kind of sacred order, and that there's a place in which you have in that sacred order, competitive urge and striving for superiority gets to be heightened. Now, that can be read again as, there's striving for superiority as something modern, and I would want to resist, on the other hand, that, right? Greece is a very good example where striving for superiority. Nietzsche is a good, you can read very well in Nietzsche about it. He has got this essay on Homer on competition. And it's this essay that basically starts with the idea of the early Greek competitiveness meant a kind of struggle to extinction, and destruction. And that's this bad Eris that Hesiod is mentioning, and kind of more tamed form of Eris. And some of the Greek cities had also a kind of sense, if somebody was too strong and no longer able to have any competitors, he would be driven out of the city. Because to have one person dominating in such a way was unhealthy for the kind of competition, controlled competition, that they thought was essential for the life of the city. So you see in different areas, in different traditions, where at least some control of the striving of superiority ought to be there. Whether and to what extent something like radical humility that is there in Paul can be found in other traditions. I think Buddhism might be a good candidate for this, though again, my knowledge of those traditions is relatively limited. And I don't want to make anything in what I say depend on, if it's not found elsewhere, it doesn't mean that that's therefore right if it's found in the Christian faith. That is to say, Christian distinction. And maybe then I might say superiority in this regard would not be a plus for my position. That is to say, my general position on this question is, if I'm interested in truth, the more people share the truth, the happier I am. And therefore, I'm not necessarily interested in Christianity being as distinct as possible. I am actually interested in Christianity being as little distinct as possible, to the extent that it is true, right?
I know you're not an economist, and neither am I, but you were introduced by one. And so if we shift from superiority to excellence, what's the cultural and economic ramifications of that?
Well, I think there may be more economists here than just sitting here. I know that they in fact are. I think that will be the question the question for them. I think my own very, very amateurish comment at the very beginning was that at least Warren Buffett, from what I've read of his own statements, what I've read also in some of the articles about him, is making the claim that even on economic terms, you may want to advocate non-comparative, non-striving for superiority, that it may be distraction. The arguments that I've seen, and I'm sure you all know them much better than I do, are that it distracts you from your own excellence and therefore makes you, by that fact, less competitive or less good at what you are doing. So whether that makes sense in the economic field, please. But I may, excuse, please, yes, I don't want to. It's always an important question, right? What trumps what in our discussions, right? So if something makes less economic sense, if something makes less political sense, performative sense, it will be a value judgment that one would have to motivate somehow, that for that reason, that might not be something that is desirable. And I think I would want also that kind of discussion to be much more part of our larger public debate. And part of the reason for doing this is just to expand the space within which the discussion of this sort can occur. So I imagine the world as God's home. That's why I think when God created the world, God thought, why am I doing this? Why all this work? Which of course God didn't have to do very much, right? Because God just spoke. At any rate, but lots of things have happened. Why is this? And my response to that is, I think Book of Revelation, Bible's response to that, is for God to make the world in the home of humanity and of God together. And if that is the kind of overarching goal, then it seems to me all the way from how our psychology works to how our politics, how our economics work, would have to somehow fit into this homemaking project. And that's where the temptation of theologians' superiority come into view, right? And that temptation is such because one of the things that theologians are supposed to be doing, but often aren't, is to look at the really big picture into which everything kind of fits. Now, that can be invitation to hubris, or that can be an invitation to despair and depression, because it's virtually impossible. No, because it's impossible to do.
Okay, I'm sorry if this is weirdly specific, but how would you say that mindset of I am competing against others, and yet when others are doing what I would theoretically be doing, I would consider that to be enough for others, but it is not enough for myself?
Very good question. Excellent question. I find that more specific the questions are of this sort, the better they are. They're at the level of how life works, right? So let's imagine I have a friend, and we like to play tennis against each other. And tennis obviously is one of those domains in which excellence is not established by some rules. There are rules by which you play, but excellence is really kind of established in the history and the process of that game. And let's say that we play each other because we're both interested in improving our game. And so competition now serves the precise purpose of improving the game of each one of us. Let's say that in this process of competing, we also come to conclusion that my friend is just a little bit better than I am. What do I make of this? And I think it will depend what my goal is. Is my goal to be better than him? Or is my goal to play tennis really well as I can? Or enjoy playing tennis? And sometimes the line would be hard to draw because I wouldn't quite know my motivations as well. But on the whole, if I step back and if I said, my motivation is actually, I want to improve my game and I want to spend time with my friend, whether he ends up being consistently better or I may be frustrated a little bit about it, but we're going to go and we're going to drink beer together, and it's going to cement rather than undermine in any ways our friendship. And above all, that won't spill over to our general evaluation of each other. This is one domain, and that domain is not definitive of humanity in any significant sense of the term. In other words, I can do with a friend of mine like this, and I ought to do with a friend of mine what Apostle Paul urges us to do, namely, outdo one another in showing honor. Even though he's outdone me in tennis, I can try to outdo him in showing him the honor, and he can do vice versa, and maybe I particularly need it because my ego is a little bit fragile after each of those games. I don't know whether that sounds very airy, but that's how I would go about pursuing this for myself. And I realize that much of it has to do with very fine texture of our souls. and what happens in our hearts. But you know, one of the things that I taught the class, Faith and Globalization, for 3 years at Yale. And the book I wrote, From Flourishing, arose out of it. I think one of the most important lessons for me is something that I shouldn't have had to teach that class to learn. And that is that kind of most intimate desires of our hearts and the global operation of global systems are not two separate things, that they bleed into one another. And that there is a significance and importance for me, even functioning in those large systems, to kind of introspectively work on the shape of myself in the situations in which I find myself, and that the beauty of my humanity will precisely be recognized in what happens in my interior life. Now, I'm completely, in this regard, son of my mother, because she was attentive to what's happening in her heart. And I remember so vividly her talking to me. And then she had this gesture which goes like this, something like this, when she was talking about it, talks about what's happening in the world, but the most important things in the world don't happen in DC, do not happen in Moscow, do not happen in Beijing, they happen right here. Each individual. And I kind of think that's true.
This question's from Zoom, but they're asking, what do you think of this idea of striving for superiority in the West versus in the Eastern, like cultures and traditions and religions?
I don't know enough to know what I think. But I mean, and specimen of my domain of my knowledge is relatively limited. When I observe students, when I read, when I encounter my colleagues, I somehow don't see the difference. It seems to me that the competition is fierce. Or take it on a global scale. One of my concerns actually with striving for superiority isn't just what happens in individual hearts. It's because what happens in the individual hearts also happens in Beijing and Moscow and Washington, D.C. And right now, well, maybe Budapest also, add Budapest, add Kiev to it, and you can add a variety of metropolises. Metropoli? What's the plural? And then you see the striving for superiority that's going on. Maybe United States, as somebody has suggested yesterday night, day before yesterday evening to me, maybe United States is now learning how to live having lost the superiority, the unquestioned superiority that it once had. But that suggests that there is a struggle, which I think Putin thinks there is, which I think Beijing thinks there is, and so forth, right? So it's a worldwide, I think, phenomenon. But I think it would be interesting to see how different religious traditions, cultural traditions deal with the issue.
And this is more of a personal question. I'm an athlete, I'm a swimmer, and I guess within swimming, like, we attribute our values to how we perform. It's very performative based. But I guess even if in a way you're striving to better yourself and swim faster, you're striving for excellence, but in a way isn't the unintended consequence that you're striving for superiority because you're swimming faster than someone else? How do you
Well, being superior than somebody else is just a fact of life in some domain. And I think that's okay. That's being excellent, right? And a consequence of striving for excellence will be, as you completely rightly state, will be a kind of result will be that A is better than B in certain activity called C. But that result itself is not problematic. Problematic is that I strive to achieve, make that substantive achievement, in this case, swimming really fast, right? That I'm interested in, I'm interested in differential in value between myself and the other person, and not in the activity itself. I understand, and I'm told, although I'm not familiar with it, there are athletes who really perform completely irrespective of where they are in the pack. And some of the very top athletes, there is this very famous endurance runner, woman endurance runner, who outruns all the competition, but basically she does not think about competition at all. She just runs because that's what she wants to competing with herself, gives her joy, whatever it does. That's kind of the image that I have. You know, and we've seen the kind of stifling effects on our children also when you introduce, it's particularly visible when you introduce kind of children that are incredibly sponge-like when they're very young, and then you introduce competition into it. It doesn't, the learning does not necessarily improve. It can be stifled. For some it does, but for many it does not. So, but as you see, I am doing something very interdisciplinary. And interdisciplinarity means that comments that I'm making are comments of an amateur who has impressions about what's going on in other fields, even in other domains of practice, like swimming in your case. And I'm doing so. This is kind of a risky thing to do, obviously, right? Because I'm doing so because we need to think together with the wisdom of all of us together comprehensively about something that permeates virtually all domains of our lives.
Time for another one? Another question? In Luke chapter 9, Jesus has the disciples go out and they come back and they aren't able to cast out some of the demons that have been requested. And so in Luke 10, Jesus sends the 70 out who are not the 12 disciples, and they come back and they celebrate and say, oh, we cast out demons, and Jesus says, and it says they came back rejoicing that they had cast out these demons. And Jesus says, yes, I even saw Satan fall like lightning. But he says, don't rejoice in that, but rejoice that your name is written in heaven. And then, then the man comes to Jesus and says, what should I do to inherit eternal life? But so he's taking away the wonderful thing, and it's talking about this gathering, right? That you're part of the people of heaven. Is that grace? Is that the antidote to the problems we have?
Absolutely wonderful. To my shame, I did not think of that parable, but it's a perfect illustration of, especially of the distinction which I was trying to make between being better at something and simply being better as person. In many ways, that's the contrast. This is a religious performance of religious acts, whether that's those are acts of holiness or acts of power or something like that. In contrast to that is rejoice that your names are written in the book of life. Rejoice in the fact of your sheer humanity, in which you are absolutely equal with anybody. Anybody's book can be written anybody's name can be written in the book of life. I have, for similar purposes, I have used the passage in Paul, where he speaks that wants to encourage Corinthians to run in the race. One receives the prize, so run that you win the prize, and you think, wow, now this is a striving for superiority at its worst. Except that when he's done with his comparison, prize is that your name is written again in the book of life, right? So that you are that which everybody else not only can, but is invited and given a gift to be. Thank you for that. I will use it. Do I have your permission?
Feel free, just, right.
Thank you all for coming out. The next to last question you gave, again, brought us back to interdisciplinarity. I am from a discipline that is known as the Imperial Social Science. We are the ones who claim to be able to explain all sorts of things about economics, but also political science and sociology and all those sorts of things. One of the things, though, I find is that economics can explain a lot, but it can't explain everything. And I really like to have another discipline that allows me to think a little bit more about the issues that matter to me. And so whatever you came in as, I hope theology is one of those places, one of many places, that will help you think a little bit different about you as a business person, a scientist, an artist, a philosopher. And so for me, I wouldn't have thought about striving for superiority, but I'm glad I was able to hear this and learn from it. And so I encourage you to come back to other UNCA events so you can hear more and think more about life in very different ways. But I want to give a warm thank you for our great speakers. So I hope you'll join me on that. And I hope you have a great night. Thank you all.